So these are the paintings I made during the summer of 2023 in Tossa de Mar, Costa Brava, Catalunya, Spain. Several tributaries brought me to this project. I began with the intention to paint a suite of works on paper during my summer in Spain. I've had an abiding preoccupation with the problem of war. Um, maybe it grew most recently. As a bit of background, I'm a painter, I'm an artist. My education was based in architecture. My graduate degree was in Southern California in Claremont Graduate School. But before all that, I was a sailor. Um, I joined the Navy right out of high school. And in order to get an interesting job and not swab the decks for 2 years, I joined for 4 and extended another year in order to get a little bit more interesting job, which was operations specialist, basically the brain of the ship, and which involved radars and creating a picture of the world for the decision makers of the ship to do their job. Back in the Navy, it was the end of the Vietnam War. We're talking about the later 70s, the last half of the 70s. And during that time, it was a bit of a relief that the war was over. It was actually ended. The war in Vietnam ended during my first spring in the Navy. My ship was USS Truxtun, and we were doing a Westpac, Western Pacific deployment. We were off the coast of the Philippines, and one of the nice memories, tragic and nice, was rescuing Vietnamese refugees on boats in the South China Sea. And that was quite gratifying, although tragic, in that it was not uncommon to see dead Vietnamese strapped to the roof of these rafts that families were unwilling to let them drift off into the ocean. The 5 years was uneventful, peaceful, filled with training and shore leave and exotic ports and this is a long story, but it was a peaceful time. But there was a small amount of chatter, a topic that people didn't want to delve too deep into, but the whole issue of the Gulf of Tonkin and the causes of the war and stuff like this. There was a sort of abiding idea that not everything was proper. But we were sailors and soldiers. We understood that we served the country, and we took everyone in various degrees, but I think all to a profound level, took our oath to the Constitution quite seriously, and we felt it. After those days, and after I left the Navy and started my educational career, which I had over-designed perhaps, but I'm proud and I value my education that I had designed to begin with, an undergraduate degree in architecture and then segue into fine arts. Was a sequence of wars that our country was involved with. The Gulf War, the Iraq War, Libya, Syria, Afghanistan. And over time, my faith in the country was a bit shaken. And I've come to the realization that Smedley Butler was spot on when he said war's a racket. Now we're in Iraq. And Iraq is in the back of my mind as I'm rereading the Iliad. Another tributary is my background, um, my family. I'm My mother's from the Philippines. My father's an American. She was born in um, Manila, Quezon City. She studied in Spain. And my father, from Missouri, born in Texas, but he was in the Army stationed in Okinawa when the Korean War began. And these are stories that he doesn't tell very often, but well, he did not tell very often as I was growing up. It was later on, as the years went on, uh, the realization that he was scarred so deeply from that experience, principally from the day that his unit of 289 men was surrounded by North Koreans, probably Chinese as well, and was wiped out, save only 14 men. And he was one of the 14 that uh, escape a kind of box canyon and semi-surrounded. And he only told the story. I heard him one night with my uncles describing what had happened. It was like late night over a campfire, and I was sort of semi-asleep but listened to bits of the story. But he never spoke about it very much, and we're talking about scenes of utter desperation and hand-to-hand combat, stuff like that is quite desperate and horrible. He succumbed to PTSD 50 years later after the anniversary of that battle, after struggling with a bit and a long, slow decline. And eventually, the VA couldn't help him. They gave him shock treatments. He suffered from uh, uncontrollable flashbacks, and he took his own life, pistol to the heart. That At that time, I had considered thoughts about suicide before he pulled the trigger. That suicide was a violence that you perpetrate on the ones that love you. But after that moment, how could I fault him for finding the only exit from a condition that there was no cure? On my mother's side of the family, my grandfather was a patriarch in the classic sense, dominating individual, formidable, loving, but hard. And he hated Americans. It's a story I hesitate to tell, but he formed a kind of basis which I had resisted in my mind, critique of American adventurism, imperialism. He was bitter about the American occupation in Philippines. And he would tell me and tell the family in long extended stories, sort of post-dinner lectures. He was a lawyer, sort of he had an ambition to politics in the Philippines, which did not succeed. He was a professor or a teacher as well. In what capacity, I'm not sure, university or whatever it was. But he had that bearing about him. And at the end of dinners, he would hold forth in very long lectures. It was not uncommon. And the last time I saw him, most of my family emigrated to Australia. The last time I saw him, he gave two very extended lectures about the real history of the Philippines. The Battle of Manila Bay was a lie. The American presence was unjust and brutal, and it had quite an impact on me. All these years, I had absorbed it, understood it. My faith in my country was not shaken because I still have an abiding respect and love for the design of our Constitution. But year after year, up to recent years, it became harder and harder to deny that since the turn of the 20th century onward, the Smedley Butler analysis is correct ultimately, and that a lot of our activity abroad has a suspicious basis. And ultimately, now with the war in Ukraine, it's so undeniable, it's pathetic. In April 18, 2022, I bled my feelings about the war in Ukraine in a blog post titled, "What Strange Times." Life is short and art is long, so I wanted to silo these thoughts in a single blog post and vent these thoughts solely in the Twitter platform. But the thoughts that one buries has a tendency to sprout to the surface, and since the war had been so painfully prolonged, I felt perhaps meditation and paint could relieve some pressure. During the past year and a half, questions grew in my mind. How deep is bellicosity imprinted in our nature? To what degree is the West uniquely inclined toward hegemonic domination? I've been thinking about Thucydides' Melian dialogues. And to paraphrase, the strong do what they can while the weak do what they must. It's a fascinating moment, quite tragic, and it was remarkable that Thucydides had reported this and recreated the exchange between the Athenians and the Melians in such an honest way to give justice to both sides of that argument. At that time, Athens was at war with Sparta. Sparta had dominated armies on the ground, and Athens, port city, was able to dominate the sea with their navy. And as a result, they had to have compliance with all the islands in the Aegean Sea. The Melians were the holdouts, and they saw it as their duty to bring them into the alliance in order to have an ultimately strong hand against the Spartans. But what a strong hand. Too strong. The strong do what they can, while the weak do what they must. These are the foundations of the West. The Iliad is more than a simple celebration of war. Homer never untangles a tragedy from the glory of conflict. This is a Bronze Age story, and from the contemporary perspective, the question of agency is astonishing. In the story, the will of the gods is mixed with man to a nearly undistinguished degree. What emerges is a question of whether we really have evolved from this frame of mind 3,000 or 4,000 years later. Do we will consciously what's going on now? in international relations? Or are we driven by an agency outside of ours? Book 1, Quarrel, Oath, and Promise. Anger be now your song, immortal one. Achilles' anger doomed and ruinous, that caused Achaeans loss on bitter loss, and crowded brave souls into the undergloom, leaving so many dead, carrion for dogs and birds, and the will of Zeus was done. Begin it when the two men, first contending, broke with one another. I titled this one Disputa. Robert Fitzgerald titled Book 1, Quarrel, Oath, and Promise. In Book 2, the army musters in preparation for war. Fitzgerald titles it Assembly and Muster of Armies, so I titled it Reunion. So it seemed appropriate to show the muster. And if you've ever been in the military, it's quite a natural thing to begin the day in sorted ranks, listening to the orders to come. Book 3, Dueling for a Haunted Lady. I titled it Duello, a duel. In this chapter, Menelaus faces off with Paris. Book 4, A Bow Shot Brings War. Tiro de flecha. In this chapter, a Trojan archer fires an arrow, hitting Menelaus in the thigh. In the previous chapter, the gods had protected Paris, sweeping him off the battlefield in a cloud. But continuing on, and the war begins in earnest, one of the principal characters is taken out. Book 5. A hero strives with gods. Esforzarse. Basically, in this chapter, the battle continues, intensifies. Book 6. Interludes in Field and City. Interludios. In this chapter, Hector returns to Troy. This is a tender portrait of a family man. There's an interlude in battle, so he goes home to recharge, to see his family. And it is indeed a tender portrait. And it seemed appropriate to paint tenderly. Book 7, A Combat and a Rampart. Combate. In this chapter, Ajax squares off with Hector. This is a duel to a draw. Ajax is one of the stalwarts in this book, together with Diomedes, Odysseus, a few others, but not a lot. Book 8, The Battle Swayed by Zeus. I titled it Palanca, because in this chapter, and all the book, the gods are fighting as much as the mortals. And in this chapter, Athena enters the fray. Book 9, A Visit by Emissaries. Supplica. In this book, Odysseus and Phoenix entreat Achilles to fight. Achilles sulking in his tent. The soldiers need him on the battlefield, or they would be lost. Achilles refuses. Book 10, Night in the Camp of 4A. Incursion Nocturna, the night raid. Night has fallen and the Greeks are repairing by their ships beached by the sea. Odysseus and Diomedes decide to go out, gather intelligence, attack whatever they can attack, sapping the strength of the Trojans. Book 11. Prowess and Wounds of Achaeans. Matanza. In this chapter, a killing spree. The battle shifts against the Greeks. Book 12, The Rampart Breached. Muralla Violada. The last chapter in this one and the ones to come, basically the tide of battle are against the Greeks. The Trojans are pushing them against, and basically they want to wipe them out. And Zeus is enabling this, principally to bring Achilles to that point where he decides to enter the battle, and then Achilles' destiny would be that much closer. Book 13, Assault on the Ships. Media del Barco, the battle into the ramparts and now amidships. Book 14, Beguilement on Mount Ida. Seductor. In this chapter, Hera seduces Zeus as a distraction from her efforts to aid the Greeks. This chapter is much like the one earlier called Interludios, chapter 6. We have a kind of break, but this is Hera who is struggling for the side of the Greeks against the Trojans, against Zeus. And she distracts Zeus as they make love, hidden in a cloud, a golden cloud of Zeus making. Book 15, The Lord of the Storm. Señor de la Tormenta. Zeus energizes the Trojans. In this chapter, Zeus is sort of stopping from being a complete desolation for the Greeks. He can't have that happen. So, of course, he had recovered from his lovemaking session in his surprise and anger, and he rejoins and turns the tide of battle. At this point, the Trojans were at the moment where they were about to set fire to the ships. And Ajax, we see Ajax on the deck of one of the ships, holding them back, right at the edge of doom. Book 16, A Ship Fired, the Tide Turned. In this book, Patroclus emerges in Achilles' war gear, basically impersonating Achilles, hoping to bring hope to the Greeks so that they thought that Achilles had finally engaged into the melee. Patroclus, of course, the favorite of Achilles, a dear friend, so dear that he becomes the key in which Achilles meets his doom later. Kairos is defined as a propitious moment for decisive action. Book 17, Contending for a Soldier Fallen. Contención, the struggle to recover the body of Patroclus. Patroclus who dies at the hands of Hector, and the Greeks and the Trojans are struggling to strip him, at least the Trojans, to strip him of his gear, the Greeks to bring him back to Achilles. A tragic, sad moment. Book 18, The Immortal Shield. Escudo. Thetis, the mother of Achilles, seeks to help her son. She's able to go into Olympus and ask the god Hephaestus to fabricate new war gear because he lost his gear from the death of Patroclus, and Hector strips the gear. So we have a kind of doubling now. Hector is wearing Achilles' war gear, but now Achilles is having new gear created for him by the gods. And in this chapter is an extended description of the shield, quite a remarkable description. I'm reminded of a couple of things. I'm reminded of Ray Bradbury's Illustrated Man, where two vagrants, or hobos, I guess, in those days, encamp by a fire overnight, and one of them is tattooed head to toe, and the younger one is mesmerized by these tattoos, which come alive and create the scaffolding for the series of short stories in his book. And Homer's description of the shield is much like that, sort of engrossing stories within stories, worlds within worlds. And the world of this is the shield of Achilles. The other thing it reminds me of is Goya's paintings, his earlier pastoral paintings, which seem so gentle in their description of the Spanish countryside, except for when you look in deeper. Typically, you can see stagecoach robberies, much like in Homer's description of the shield, pastoral landscapes with treachery in the detail of them. Book 19, The Avenger Fasts and Arms. Recargar. Achilles and Agamemnon reconcile. The troops refresh and recharge. They take stock. This reminds me of the guerrilla diary of Perez Lopez, titled Dark and Bloody Ground. It's a diary of the Spanish Civil War. And in the story, a lot of it is spent in logistics. How much food does he have? How much ammunition does he have? Where can they hide? What they needed to bring with them and what they needed to leave behind. Who were their friends? Where was the enemy? So in this painting, I thought it wise to take stock of the elements that constitute these paintings. Book 20, The Ranging of Powers. Matadero. Matadero means butchery or slaughterhouse. Death everywhere. Book 21, A Clash of Man and River. Dios del Rio. As I've said, the Trojan War was not just Greeks and Trojans, but gods fighting one another. Achilles is crossing the river Xanthus, basically the barrier between the Greeks and the Trojans. And like the winds, the river is a god. Here in Spain, the winds have names. There's a name for every wind on the compass rose. In these days, they were more than just names of the direction of wind, but divine agency. In this case, the river Xanthus is offended that he's glutted with the bodies of Trojans. Achilles is slaughtering them left and right. So the river god rises to stop him. Book 22, Desolation Before Troy. Aniquilación. Achilles kills Hector. Book 23, A Friend Consigned to Death. Luto. Achilles mourns the death of Patroclus. They cremate his body and have a wake in the form of funeral games. And Book 24, A Grace Given in Sorrow. Gratia. Achilles grants Priam the body of his son Hector. The end of bitterness, a chapter of reconciliation.